Chuck, who had just turned 85, still maintained a strong physique, though his movements had slowed, and his gray hair gave away his age. He lived quietly in a modest house on the outskirts, spending most of his time tending to his garden or reading fan mail. But that day, he decided to stop by the local diner, Joe's, an old establishment with peeling wooden walls, buzzing air conditioners, and a clientele made up mostly of retirees and farmers who complained about taxes and inflation over a cup of coffee for $1. In the corner of the diner sat Peter Grayson, a veteran of the Iraq War, who was in his 60s. His uniform hung on him like a coat hanger, and his once strong hands now trembled as he fiddled with a few coins on the table. Peter was a local legend, not for his heroism, but for how he had persevered after returning, losing a leg to a homemade IED. He had fought the bureaucracy for years to get his benefits. But the past few months had been a real test for him. With delays in government payments, he was barely scraping by. Today, he had come to Joe's with his last $3, hoping to buy at least a bowl of soup. Chuck noticed Peter right away as soon as he walked in. He sat with his head lowered, a vacant glass in front of him. Ruth, the elderly waitress, sighed as she walked by, muttering under her breath, "Poor guy. Same old story." Chuck walked up to the counter, ordered a coffee and a bacon sandwich, but his gaze kept returning to Peter. He had heard stories of veterans being abandoned, but seeing it firsthand was something else. The diner hummed with conversation. Two men at a nearby table argued about whether Congress was to blame for budget cuts, while an elderly couple complained about rising food prices. "They promised us care, and now what?" one of the men said loudly, banging his fist on the table. "My brother served for 30 years, and now he can barely afford his medicine." Chuck listened in silence, but when Ruth brought him his coffee, he quietly asked, "What's wrong with him?" nodding towards Peter. Ruth shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Peter? Same story as many others. Benefits are delayed, there's no work, and he needs to live on something. He comes here because I sometimes give him soup for free, but today we have a new manager, and he doesn't allow that." Chuck frowned. He knew what struggle was, but his life had turned out differently. Fame and savings had given him comforts Peter would never know. He stood up, grabbed his coffee, and walked over to Peter's table. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was low, but calm, as always. Peter looked up, blinking in surprise. He recognized Chuck. It was hard not to recognize the face that had lit up screens for decades. "Yeah. Sure," he muttered, pushing the coins aside as if embarrassed by them. Chuck sat down, placing his coffee on the table. "Looks like your day hasn't been great," he said, looking Peter in the eye. Peter gave a weak smile, but there was bitterness in his eyes. "The last 6 months haven't been great. I'm waiting on payments, and they keep saying under review. They say maybe something will happen by summer. What am I supposed to do, starve until then?" Chuck nodded, listening. He didn't rush to respond, but his silence was heavy with understanding. Meanwhile, a man in an expensive suit entered the diner, Tom Keller, the new manager, hired by the owners to improve profits. He glanced quickly at Peter and Chuck, then walked up to Ruth. "Is that the beggar again?" Tom asked loudly, his contempt evident. "I told you, no handouts. We run a business here, not a shelter." Ruth pressed her lips together but said nothing. Peter flinched, his fingers tightening around the coins. Chuck slowly turned his head toward Tom, his gaze becoming cold as steel. "He's not a beggar," Chuck said quietly, but loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "He's a veteran." Tom rolled his eyes, not recognizing Chuck in his simple clothes, an old hat and a worn jacket. "Veteran or not, I don't care. If he can't pay, he should leave. We don't have room for freeloaders." A hush fell over the diner. All eyes were on Chuck and Peter. One of the men at the nearby table muttered, "What an asshole." Chuck stood up, slowly but confidently. He was taller than Tom, and though the years showed, his presence still made people pause.
"Do you know what respect is?"
Chuck asked, his voice calm, but carrying authority.
"Because I can teach you."
Tom scoffed, folding his arms across his chest.
"And who are you? His lawyer?"
"No," Chuck replied, removing his hat and revealing his famous face.
"I'm Chuck Norris, and I want you to apologize to him. Right now."
The diner went silent, like a church before a sermon. Tom's eyes widened, but he quickly composed himself, though his voice trembled slightly.
I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to demean people?" Chuck took a step closer. "Apologize."
Peter raised his hand, his voice weak but firm.
"Chuck, don't. I don't want any trouble. I'll go."
But Chuck didn't back down. He looked at Peter with warmth, then back at Tom. "Nobody is going anywhere until this man hears that he is a welcome guest here." Tom flushed, his arrogance melting under the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He muttered something like sorry and turned away, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate.
Everyone waited to see what would happen next.
Chuck sat back down at Peter's table, placing a hand on his shoulder.
"Today, you're eating on my tab," he said. "And we'll talk about how I can help you."
Peter looked at him in disbelief, but a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. And at the neighboring tables, people started whispering.
"That's Chuck Norris. Did he really just do that?"
But that was just the beginning. What happened next shocked everyone in Clearwater, and not just there. The Diner Joe's was still buzzing with whispers when Chuck Norris returned to his spot at Peter's table. The sun had already set behind the horizon, casting a warm orange light that reflected off the worn metal edges of the chairs. The smell of coffee and fried potatoes mixed with a faint scent of dust drifting through the open door. The tension from the altercation with Tom hadn't dissipated. Patrons sneaked glances at Chuck and Peter, and Ruth, the waitress, nervously wiped the counter,
as if fearing the scandal might flare up again.
Peter sat silently, his fingers still gripping the coins, though he tried to hide his trembling. Chuck glanced at him, his eyes, squinted from years in sun, radiated calm confidence. "How long have you been waiting for those payments?" he asked, taking a sip of coffee. Peter sighed, his voice hoarse, as if the words were caught in his throat.
4 months. First, they said it was a technical error. Then they said my paperwork got lost. And now they're just silent. I call every week, but all I hear is we're checking." Chuck frowned, his jaw tightening just slightly. He knew what bureaucracy was, he'd faced it himself when helping friends with veterans organizations. But hearing how the system was abandoning a man who had given a leg for his country was unbearable. "That's wrong," he said quietly. "And we'll fix it." Peter looked at him doubtfully. "Chuck, I'm grateful, but what can you do? You're not a congressman." Chuck smiled at the corner of his lips, the same smile that once preceded a reckoning in his films. "I don't need a suit and tie to make people listen." Meanwhile, Tom, the manager, returned from the kitchen. His face still burned with humiliation, but he kept his distance, talking with the cook behind the counter. Chuck overheard snippets of their conversation. "Told the owners we were doing charity? He can take a hike." Peter leaned toward Chuck, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't get involved because of me. I don't want you to have problems." "Problems?" Chuck raised an eyebrow. "Peter, I live to solve problems." He pulled out an old flip phone, a relic he kept for nostalgia, and dialed a number. The room fell silent as people realized something was happening. Chuck spoke without raising his voice. "Bill, it's Chuck. Yeah, long time no see. Listen, I've got a situation here. A vet, Iraq, no benefits for 4 months. Can you do something?"
On the other end of the line, a low voice answered, Bill Thompson, an old friend of Chuck's and a former officer now working at a veterans organization in Austin.
Peter listened, holding his breath. "Give me his name and case number," Bill replied. "I'll take care of it."
Chuck looked at Peter, who quickly dictated the details, and Chuck relayed them into the phone.
After finishing, he added, "And one more thing, Bill.
There's a diner in Clearwater where they almost kicked a vet out for not being able to pay."
"I don't like that." Bill laughed. "You never change, Chuck. I'll call a buddy from the local news. Let them check it out."
Chuck hung up the phone and placed it on the table. Peter stared at him, seemingly unable to believe his eyes.
You're serious?"
"Absolutely," Chuck replied.
"But this is just the beginning."
The next morning, Clearwater woke up to the buzz of news. Local TV channel Clear 5 was already running a report. Action star Chuck Norris stands up for veteran at diner, what's going on at Joe's? Reporters parked their van in front of the establishment, while Tom Keller scrambled, trying to explain that everything had been misunderstood. But the cameras were already capturing every nervous gesture he made. Chuck sat at home, sipping tea on the porch, when his phone rang again.
It was Peter. "Chuck, turn on the TV. They're talking about us."
Chuck turned on the old TV in the living room. The screen flickered to life, showing a reporter in a bright suit standing in front of the diner. And here's what we know. Chuck Norris, whom we all remember as the invincible hero, got into a conflict with the diner manager over veteran Peter Grayson. Peter, who lost a leg in Iraq, told us he's been fighting for his benefits for months. And now the question is, why in America in 2025 are heroes still going hungry? Chuck turned off the sound and looked at Peter, who called again. "They want an interview," Peter said, his voice trembling with excitement.
"What should I do?"
"Tell the truth," Chuck replied.
"And don't be afraid. I'll be with you."
That same day, Peter gave an interview right in front of the diner. He stood, leaning on his crutch, his gray hair flowing in the wind, and though his voice was quiet, it was full of dignity.
"I'm not asking for handouts. I just want what was promised to me."
And if it wasn't for Chuck, I'd still be sitting there with $3 in my pocket. Meanwhile, Tom Keller tried to salvage his reputation. He stepped out in front of the cameras with a forced smile.
"This was a misunderstanding. We respect veterans. We even have a discount for them. Sometimes."
But the crowd that had gathered around began murmuring discontentedly.
Someone shouted, "Then why did you kick him out, Tom?"
Chuck watched all this from a car parked nearby. He didn't like the cameras, but he knew his presence gave weight to the issue. And when the reporters noticed him, they swarmed like bees to honey. "Mr. Norris, what do you have to say about the situation with veterans?" shouted a reporter, holding out a microphone. Chuck got out of the car, his gaze calm but firm.
"I'll say that we forget the ones who protect us. And if I can remind people of that, I'll do it."
The next few days, Clearwater buzzed like a disturbed hive. Social media exploded with posts about Chuck and Peter. The hashtag Justice for Peter became a trend in Texas.
But not everyone was thrilled.
The owners of the diner chain, Tex Food Corporation, sent Tom with an official statement: "We are investigating the incident and taking action." Tom, feeling his position weakening, decided to play hardball.
He called Chuck late at night, his voice tense.
"Listen, Norris, you've made a circus out of this. If you don't back down, I'll sue you for slander." Chuck, sitting on the porch under the starry sky, just laughed.
"Tom, I've made movies about guys like you. And you know what? They always lose."
The next morning, a film crew from a national channel arrived in Clearwater. The story had gone beyond the small town. Now, it was being talked about in every home from Texas to Washington. But the most interesting part was yet to come. Peter received a call from the Veterans Administration. They promised him payments, and not just for the past months, but with compensation. When he told Chuck this, Chuck merely nodded. "Good. But we're not done yet." Peter looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're not the only one," Chuck replied. "And I want all of them to get what they deserve." That same day, Chuck announced that he would organize a meeting in Clearwater for veterans facing the same issues. He stood in front of the diner as the sun set, and dozens of people, elderly men and women with medals on their chests, began gathering around him. "We're not asking for charity," he said, his voice booming over the crowd. "We're asking for justice. And we will get it." The crowd erupted in applause, but around the corner, Tom and the representative from Tex Food were already planning their next move. The story was just beginning, and no one knew how it would end, but everyone felt that Chuck Norris wasn't backing down. 2 weeks had passed since Chuck Norris announced the veterans' meeting in Clearwater. The small town, which usually dozed under the scorching Texas sun, was now buzzing with life. In the central square, where there were usually just a few benches and an old fountain with cracked marble, dozens of people had gathered. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and smoke from the grills set up by local farmers to feed the guests. Music played, someone had brought an old acoustic guitar and was playing Sweet Home Alabama, while children ran between the crowd, holding small American flags. Chuck stood on an improvised stage, a simple wooden platform put together overnight by a few local carpenters. Next to him stood Peter Grayson, dressed in a clean shirt he borrowed from a neighbor, his crutch standing beside him. The crowd was made up of veterans, men and women with graying hair, medals on their chests, and tired but proud eyes. There were also their families, friends, and just Clearwater residents who had heard about what happened at Joe's Diner. National news cameras hummed, capturing every moment. Chuck raised his hand, and the murmur quieted. His voice, though aged, still carried the strength that made people listen. "I'm not a hero," he began. "Heroes are the people standing in front of you. They gave years, health, sometimes more than we can imagine. And what did they get in return? Delays, excuses, humiliation. But today, we're here to say, enough." The crowd erupted in applause. Peter looked at Chuck, his eyes shining with tears, but he held his composure. Chuck continued. "Peter and I started this together. But this isn't just about him. It's about each of you, who have waited too long. And I promise, we won't stop until everyone gets what they deserve." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Tom Keller and a representative from Tex Food, a man in an expensive suit named Richard Blake, watched the events with sour expressions. Their plan to sue Chuck for defamation and silence him had failed when the company's lawyers realized the truth was on Norris' side. Tex Food's reputation was cracking, customers were boycotting the diners, and photos of Tom shouting at Peter spread across social media. Richard whispered to Tom, "We have to do something, or they'll crush us." Tom nodded, his hands trembling. He knew his career was hanging by a thread. And then, he did something no one expected. While Chuck was speaking, Tom suddenly stepped out of the crowd and climbed onto the stage. The cameras turned to him, reporters froze. Chuck stopped, his eyebrows raised in surprise, but he didn't say a word, just gestured for Tom to speak. Tom cleared his throat, his voice trembling, but he held his head high. I was wrong," he began. The crowd fell silent, only the wind rustled the flags. "I thought I was doing my job, but I didn't see the people. Peter, I apologize to you. And to all of you. I was a fool." Peter looked at him, his face first frozen in surprise, but then he slowly nodded. "Apology accepted," he said softly. Tom turned to Chuck. "I'm resigning from Tex Food. And I want to help. If you'll let me."
The crowd erupted. Someone shouted, "What a twist!" Someone whistled. Chuck extended his hand and firmly shook Tom's hand. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "Welcome to the team." This moment was a turning point.
The next day, Tex Food issued a statement. Not only did they apologize, but they also announced a free lunch program for veterans at all their locations across Texas. But the real magic happened when the Veterans Administration, under pressure from the media and calls from congressmen stirred by Chuck's movement, announced the acceleration of benefits for hundreds of veterans across the country. Peter received his check, with compensation for the delay, and tears rolled down his cheeks as he showed it to Chuck.
"I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice breaking. Chuck smiled. "Just live, Peter. That's enough." But the story didn't end there. The meeting in Clearwater became the beginning of something bigger. Veterans from other states began writing to Chuck, sharing their stories. Local communities followed Clearwater's example, organizing their own meetings. Even Tom, who now worked as a volunteer for the Veterans Organization, became part of the movement, helping sort papers and call officials. The final scene of this story unfolded a month later. Chuck sat on his porch, holding a letter from Peter. Inside was a photograph, Peter with his family, his wife and grandchildren, at a table full of food. On the back, it said, "Thank you, Chuck. You gave me back more than money." Chuck leaned back in his chair, watching the sunset.
The sky over Clearwater blazed with red and gold, and in the distance, a train rumbled, carrying its sounds into the night. He didn't know what would come next, whether it would be possible to change the entire system, or if this would just be a small victory. But he knew one thing: a small step, taken with heart, could awaken an entire country. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, Chuck felt what everyone who witnessed this story felt. The euphoria of knowing that justice is possible, that one voice, even one as old as his own, can change the world.